Let's take a look at what is the most obvious long-term trend in China, and look at the consumption situation. Consumption profile. The previous section demonstrated that China's productivity is extremely strong, and there is no problem with the material basis of consumption. Don't underestimate this achievement, its significance cannot be overstated. We are the only developing country in this state. Some so-called developed countries rely on overdraft borrowing to import goods to maintain their living standards. Considering that we account for half of the world's industrial output, it can be said that the Earth is unique. Internationally, the proportion of final consumption to GDP is used to evaluate the proportion of consumption, which is further divided into two categories: final consumption of residents and final consumption of the government. China's final consumption accounted for about 55% in recent years, the lowest among large countries, and only lower than Ireland, Qatar, Singapore, Brunei, Luxembourg, and other small countries with small populations and special circumstances. The United States is about 82%, Japan is about 75%. India is about 72%, and Vietnam is about 65%. Except for China, regardless of whether it is a developing country or a developed country. Countries with slightly larger economies account for more than 64% of final consumption. The formation of China's fixed assets and the proportion of final consumption form two graphs, forming a sharp contrast. China's consumption accounted for 60% to 65% in the 1990s, which was considered a relatively normal period. Later, when the investment intensity increased, the proportion of consumption continued to decline, reaching an astonishing low of 48.9% in 2010. By 2016, the proportion of consumption rose to 55%. The upward momentum has been affected in recent years, mainly due to the boom in real estate investment and the suppression of the proportion of consumption by the epidemic. World Bank data show that in 2021, the final consumption of global residents will be $52.99 trillion United States dollars, accounting for 54.9% of GDP. And the final consumption of the government will be $16.5 trillion United States dollars, accounting for 17.1%, accounting for 72% in total. In 2021, the final consumption of Chinese residents will be $6.8 trillion United States dollars, accounting for 38.1% of GDP, and the final consumption of the government will account for 15.8%, totaling 53.9%. The main reason is that the proportion of household consumption is too low. U.S. household consumption accounts for 68.2% of GDP, and government consumption accounts for 14.4%, totaling 82.6%. The final consumption of Chinese residents only accounts for 12.8% of the world's total, while the final consumption of U.S. residents accounts for 30% of the world's total, accounting for 2.3 times that of China, and the per capita final consumption is 10 times that of China. Therefore, the proportion of China's household consumption is significantly low in the world. Moreover, the consumption that the Chinese pay attention to is mainly industrial and agricultural, construction, and manufacturing goods, goods such as food and drink, electrical appliances, housing, and automobiles. They think life is okay, or they think it is not good. They can't afford good houses and fruits are too expensive. Chinese people generally don't have much feeling for service fees. The monthly fee for a mobile phone is tens or hundreds of dollars, and it's tens or hundreds of dollars for minor illnesses. Yuan. However, this is not the case in developed countries. The consumption of services is very large, greatly exceeding the consumption of physical goods. The annualized GDP of the United States in the second quarter of 2023 is 26.835 trillion US dollars, of which personal consumption is 18.3053 trillion US dollars, accounting for 68.2%. Among personal consumption, commodity consumption was 6.0954 trillion yuan, accounting for 33.3%. And service consumption was 12.2099 trillion yuan, accounting for 66.7%, exactly twice the commodity consumption. The consumption of medical services is 2.9243 trillion, accounting for 16%. Almost half of the consumption of goods and the consumption of housing and facilities services is 3.2161 trillion, accounting for 17.6%. The sum of the two exceeds the consumption of goods. Finance, insurance, transportation, entertainment, catering and other service consumption add up to a commodity consumption. Based on the population of 333 million in the United States, the annualized value of per capita consumption is 55,000 US dollars and 27,500 US dollars in half a year. The National Bureau of Statistics announced that the per capita consumption expenditure of Chinese residents in the first half of the year was 12,739 yuan, an increase of 8.4%. However, based on the average exchange rate of 6.9181 in the first half of the year, the half-year consumption is only 1,841 US dollars, which is only equivalent to 1/15 of the per capita consumption of American residents. In the first half of the year, the per capita medical service consumption in the United States was 4,390 US dollars, and the per capita housing and facility service consumption was 4,830 US dollars, which were 2.4 times and 2.6 times the total consumption expenditure of Chinese residents respectively. The difference in per capita consumption data between China and the United States is a bit exaggerated and even incomprehensible. China's data is a sample survey of 160,000 households, which tends to be underreported and should represent the expenditure of ordinary people. People with higher incomes are less willing to accept the survey. However, the data in the United States is a bit inflated. The consumption of medical services is so high, and the average life expectancy is not very high. The sum of all kinds of consumption of Americans costs 55,000 US dollars per person per year, or 380,000 yuan, and a family of 3 costs millions of yuan. The actual income is really not that high. For example, in the consumption of housing services, there is virtual rent in it, and the rent of self-housing should be converted according to the market price. Another example is medical expenses. Often it is not actually going to see a doctor, but buying medical insurance. If you are robbed by medical interest groups, you can't buy it, but the company will help buy part of it. Even if there is an underestimation, the data can also show that the consumption of Chinese residents is really low. There are 3 phenomena. First, earn more and spend less and pay more attention to saving. The social savings rate is high. Second, the price is low, especially the service price is very low. Third, the income of ordinary workers is relatively low. The relevant data of the World Bank is called gross domestic savings, percent of GDP, which is actually 100% minus the previous final consumption to GDP ratio. China's savings rate is 45%, which is far ahead among major countries.